My guest at this time is former New York City Police Commissioner Bernard Kerik, who served in that capacity when terror struck our nation on 9/11. He joins me now for some reflections on that horrific day and also to discuss his new book, The Grave Above the Grave, which is a fictional thriller about a New York City Police Commissioner responding to another terrorist attack. And Mr. Kerik, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, sir.
Tuesday, of course, marks 17 years since the 9/11 attacks, and anyone old enough to remember it has vivid memories. Some families tragically remember the horror of losing their loved ones. Most of us were horrified and numbed by it all. You obviously couldn't afford to be numb. You had to act and act decisively. So what comes to mind first about how you heard about the attack and how you immediately responded?
I actually heard about it. My chief of staff came into my office. I was actually taking a shower. I just finished exercising, and he said that a plane just hit Tower 1. And I went to a television above a treadmill, and I looked at it. I looked at the damage, and I was thinking, initially it was a small aircraft, a Cessna twin engine or something. And when I saw the damage, it looked too severe. So I actually walked into my conference room, pulled back open the blinds, and I could see the building. We were only about a quarter of a mile from the towers. I could see the damage to the top of the building, and I didn't think that was no small aircraft. I called the mayor, and I told him I would meet him at 7 World Trade Center, which was directly across the street from Tower 1. That's where our city's command center was. And I got down there within 7 or 8 minutes. I tried to pull on the Vesey Street with my staff, and we were stopped by a police sergeant who came up to my vehicle and said, "Look, you can't turn into the block, they're jumping." And I didn't, immediately, I didn't grasp what he was talking about, and I stepped out of the vehicle. And for the next several minutes, I watched, 2,000 people jump from the top of Tower 1, and they were landing on Vesey, and they were landing in the courtyard between the two buildings. And the mayor showed up about 5 minutes later, and just 2 or 3 minutes before he got there, the second aircraft slammed through the top of Tower 2 on top of us. So we had to go behind World Trade 7, to get out of the way and wait for the debris to come down. And the mayor rolled up 2 or 3 minutes later.
What's going through your mind when you know that a second plane has hit the other tower?
I didn't see that plane. That plane came from the southern end of Manhattan and blew out the north side of the tower where I was standing. I could hear the aviation pilots, the NYPD's helicopter pilots, yelling that another jetliner had slammed through Tower 2, and at that point, I realized we were under attack. So the response for this city changed immediately after realizing that, to the point that we had to evacuate City Hall. We actually evacuated police headquarters, which was only a quarter of a mile, maybe a half a mile from the buildings. We evacuated all of the major buildings on the skyline, so the UN, the Empire State Building, and other high-rise buildings, because we didn't know, or I didn't know how many more planes there were. I didn't know if there were mass transit attacks planned. I didn't know if there would be anything on the ground planned. So we basically shut down the city, and I think that was the first time in the city's history that it was actually closed. I think, if you remember, there were these big signs, New York City closed, and nobody was allowed in or out except for first responders. And that's the way the day started.
Obviously, the police has response plans in general for any sort of situation. Did you have anything ready for something of this magnitude?
Greg, we had planned for years, from 1996 right up into 2001. Mayor Giuliani created the Office of Emergency Management in 96, always thinking about the 93 bombings of the World Trade Center the first time. And from 96 on, we had planned and practiced, and we did these mock drills and tabletop exercises, dealing with the possibilities of mass transit attacks, of a sarin gas attack, of every terrorist event you could think of, but nobody ever planned or thought or imagined that somebody would fly these planes into buildings. However, every plan and protocol that we had in place went into effect that morning, and had we not been so prepared, I think our losses would have been far more extreme than what they were.
Describe the effort after the second plane hit the second tower to get as many folks out as you could, and then what your reaction was and how you responded once Tower 2 came down.
When Tower 2 actually imploded, the mayor and I were in a building just north of the tower, about a block and a half, 2 blocks north. The mayor was on the phone with the White House. He was talking to President Bush as one of his advisors, Chris Hennick. Chris was getting the vice president to the phone, and all of a sudden he came back to the phone. He told the mayor, he said, "We think that the Pentagon just got hit, and they're evacuating the White House. I have to go," and he hung up on him. And the mayor looked at me and he said, "Oh, my God, that's not good." And he told me what happened. And just as he did, the building we were actually standing in, it felt like a freight train was coming through the side of it. And the door slammed open, and my chief of department, Joe Esposito, he came in the building and started yelling, "Everybody get down, the building's coming down." And that was Tower 2. It imploded just about on top of us. And we were actually trapped inside that building for, 25, 30 minutes until we found our way out. We couldn't get out the way we came in. It was all blocked with debris. So we wound up getting these maintenance guys to open a series of doors to get us out through the basement about a block away.
And then what do? You had so many personnel, of course, dedicated to the rescue effort at that point. What orders are you giving then?
Well, at that point, the plans and protocols for the rescue itself are in place. The fire department, the police department, the Port Authority police, and even the Department of Correction. We had the emergency service unit from the Department of Correction basically pulling as many people out of that area, out of the buildings as possible. I think if there's one thing that's gone unsaid, and I tried to stress this yesterday when I was talking to a number of people, the first responders on that day effected what I think is the greatest rescue mission in the history of our country. They took 20 to 25,000 people out of those buildings and the immediate surrounding area, but they also evacuated more than 1 million people out of Manhattan into the 4 boroughs and into New Jersey through the harbor with the assistance of the New Jersey State Police, the Jersey City Police, Newark Police. It was an effort that's been unparalleled, as far as I know, anywhere in this country ever.
How do you even begin to describe the actions of the men and women that served underneath you that day?
When you think of what a cop, firemen and cops do on a daily basis, right? They go out and they put their lives on the line. They do so. They know the dangers. They know what they have to deal with when they're out in the field. But on this day, the perils inherent with what they were doing, especially after Tower 2 imploded. Tower 2 imploded, and anybody that didn't die in the building or wasn't killed as a result of people falling, they ran back into one. Now that's courage and that's bravery, yes, but it's beyond that because you knew what had just happened, but they didn't care, and they went back into that building. They went back into that area, and we lost a number of them that died as a result when Tower 1 itself imploded.
Lastly, on this subject, we'll get to the book in just a moment. What's your message for political leaders as well as the public as each day and each year go by since 9/11? Don't
forget the lessons learned from that day. Don't take life for granted. don't forget what happened. Don't forgive. Make sure that we do everything in our power not to allow this to happen again, and that includes our intelligence capabilities have to be better than they've ever been before. Take care of the men and women that work for you. We have members in Congress right now that will not support and have not supported, and we're battling for them to support the medical programs for the first responders. And we have close to 10,000 right now that have toxic, cancerous-related illnesses as a result of what happened 17 years ago. And you have members of Congress that just outright refuse to help them, which I find completely insane. You ask these men and women to go do a job. You have to give them the resources they need to do that job, and then you have to take care of them when something happens. And it sends a hell of a message to our law enforcement community around the country when you don't do that.
We're talking with former New York City Police Commissioner Bernard Kerik, and as I mentioned at the introduction, he's also the author of a new fictional thriller, The Grave Above the Grave. It's about a New York City Police Commissioner responding to a terrorist attack, so clearly he draws on a considerable amount of personal experience for this. It is a fictional thriller, Mr. Commissioner, but I know a lot of times in this genre, it's based on real-world threats and concerns. Is that a foundation for this book as well?
Yes, it is. It's, as you said, it's a fictional police commissioner in New York City. But in my own world, in reality, I lived and worked in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for 4 years, from 78 to 80 and 82 to 84. I worked for the King of Jordan for 5 years. Now, that's not stuff that's in the book, but I draw on that insight. I draw on that knowledge to create some of the events, some of the characters, some of the bad guys that I've become familiar with over the last many, many years.
And what do you want folks to know about this? Is this about things and ideas of how to respond to terrorist attacks that have been going through your mind for, well, more than 17 years, probably even back to the 70s and 80s, like you just mentioned, with your time in the Middle East? How do you want folks to look at this when they read it?
Naturally, it's a thriller. It's pretty riveting. The reviews have been phenomenal so far. But when people read this, I want them to grasp the characters, the bad guys, right? So what do they think? Why do they think the way they do? How do they plan? How do they communicate? Where do they get their weapons? All this stuff that's in the book are things, when people ask me, do you think we could have another 9/11 with, 4 planes flying into major towers in the country? No, I don't. I think we're beyond that. I think we're pretty secure in that arena. But I do believe that tomorrow afternoon we could have a series of 5 or 6 different teams, shooting teams, in 5 or 6 different cities in the country, walk into elementary schools at the same day, same time, and really put this country in a manic depression. And that's what I try to stress in here. The threat is still here. The threat's something we have to deal with, and they're constantly focusing on what they want to do to us. So we're either going to kill them and take them out, or they're going to kill us.
Mr. Commissioner, I know this is not your first book. How much, I don't know if enjoyment's the right word given the solemnity of the topic, but how much did you get out of writing this?
You know what? It's not my first book. I've had 2 prior, both bio-related bios, and they were much easier. People have asked me, was this easy to do? And I would say, no, it's not easier to do. When you're creating characters, even though some of this stuff, it relates to things I've really done, or I know people that have really done. It's not easy when you're creating fictional characters, and you have to, I'd get 4 chapters in, and I want to, comment on something that somebody did, and I think, wow, what was that guy's name? What was his description? What rank was he? And I'd have to go back in the book, like I constantly did this right to the end, and I thought, wow, this is not as easy as I actually thought it would be.
Amazing. Well, Mr. Kerik, thank you so much for your service, not only in 9/11, but in many capacities throughout your career. And we thank you for your time today very much.
Thank you, sir.
Former New York City Police Commissioner Bernard Kerik served in that position on 9/11. He's also the author of the brand new fictional thriller, The Grave Above the Grave. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.